Hi everybody, and welcome to the Marshall Hangout with the title of Climate, COVID and Cages, Environmental Racism Under Lockdown. We're really pleased to have a panel of our alumni joining us today, some who I haven't seen for a while, so that's really exciting. Hello, those people I haven't seen in a while. It's great to see you. I think it's going to be a really interesting and challenging conversation, and I look forward to hearing all about it. So over to Becca. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you. It's a pleasure to see everyone via Zoom. So of course, with this topic of environmental racism under lockdown, we have not at all bit off more than we should be able to chew in about 70 minutes or so. We have with us Nico, Bianca, and Shama will be joining soon. So a range of scholars from across several years. I'm currently the oldest from 2012, but we've got 2014, 2015, and 2016 also jumping on from a variety of environmental and health public policy kinds of disciplines. So I'm going to start by just kind of talking a little bit about what environmental racism is, how we might understand it, and throw at you a bunch of kind of bits of statistics, which will hopefully serve as kind of a jumping ground for conversation. We want as soon as possible to shift away from me talking at you to listening to questions and kind of hearing where else people have been seeing this, what else you might kind of pull in from recent news and that kind of thing to kind of wrestle through what does this look like. So I'm going to go ahead and shift to a shared screen if I can, although there's, oh, good grief. Hold on, as soon as I can manage to figure out this technology. Sorry, one moment. Nope, that's not gonna, oh dear. Mary, it's not gonna let me do this unless I quit. I'm sorry, everyone. I should have tested this tech first without hosting.
I can try and make you co-host and see if it'll work. One sec.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. Alternatively, while I'm sorting out this, Nico and Bianca, would you introduce yourselves briefly, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Bianca. I was a Marshall Scholar in 2016 for the class of 2016, although I took a year out in between and did my years from 2016 to 2017 and then 2018 to 2019. And I just this past year started medical school at Stanford. When I was abroad, I studied economics and public health, and that's sort of the background and the lens that I'm coming at these issues from. And I'm very much still learning. And so I would appreciate, insights from the rest of the group as well.
Hey everyone, real quick, Nico here. I'm actually a 2013 Marshall. Went to the University of Liverpool and then London School of Economics. And a lot of the work I do is around, is all around criminal justice. Both reform and abolition, and currently I'm at Columbia University. I'm a project manager at the Justice Lab working on research around Rikers Island, both in its closing and also alternatives to incarceration, decarceration. And right now actually doing a lot of COVID research, in terms of how the virus is spreading and impacting people who are incarcerated and people who are justice involved. So in and out of jails and prisons. So excited to chat today.
Great, thank you both very much. And we'll introduce Shama when he's able to join us from other work commitments. And thank you, Mary. We are set hopefully on the tech. So climate, COVID, and cages, environmental racism under lockdown. We'll talk through what environmental racism is generally, kind of in the everyday reality, and then get into some specifics about what in today's present world is really this meaning. So firstly, a little bit of a teaser. There are some random numbers in front of you on the screen. We're not going to talk about what those numbers are yet, but for those of you who are keen on the classroom participation side of things, jot down those numbers to see if you can figure out what you think they mean in the context of environmental racism. So firstly, just some kind of general community principles for discussion. I do this anytime I'm talking with a group of students about different issues, but I think it's especially important when we are having conversations that get into quite personal values and identity aspects. So the first is, as Bianca has already teased out, we all come as learners, not experts. All of us are investigating this, and it's a hugely complex issue. So please know that you have a perspective, and we very much want to hear it, and nothing that any of us say is the absolute be-all end-all in these issues, because it's such a nuanced system. We also, when we're thinking about questions and issues of racism, we all are both oppressor and oppressed, because as soon as there's a big system, we are benefiting from parts of our identity, we are being disadvantaged by other parts of our identity, and everything that we're doing when we're in the middle of an unequal system is reproducing that system, even as we're trying to challenge and shape it. And then lastly, we all must practice and practice allyship, and here I'm being cheeky with US-UK spellings, but there's a double meaning of that verb, right? Which is that we have to practice it, we have to know that we aren't experts, and we need to get better at it, so we need to practice that as a skill. And then of course we also have to put it into practice, we have to do it constantly. So none of us are just automatically perfectly allied to any one particular community or issue, but we need to work towards that. So that's what we're trying to do a little bit of today. So environmental racism. Very simply, it's the idea that nature and environmental resources are just another platform and avenue around which systemic racism is carried out. So part of what I'll just tease through with some of these statistics is how big that system is, and the particular ways that Black, Indigenous, and persons of color in the US and UK are disadvantaged through environmental lenses, and how that is quickly tied to health, as Bianca and Nico will jump in for us. There are all kinds of definitions of racial injustice and environmental racism. Of course, this particular definition that's on the screen, it's the most text that will be on any slide today, but is coming in the 1980s from someone who was working under the United Church of Christ in North Carolina with toxic landfills and community access and proximity to those spaces. And that, along with a variety of indigenous food struggles in Latin America, very much kicked off a movement for environmental justice, looking at how likely it is that communities of color are facing unequal access to and opportunities and decision-making around what's going on in their environment. So jumping into what that looks like specifically, rather than framing this primarily in environmental racism, and thus a great negative system, which is very much the reality, the environmental justice movement is about advocating for and figuring out how we might reshape it. So most of what I'll present is in that kind of framework. And we can think of environmental justice as thinking through the distribution, the recognition, and the participation of communities and resources in environmental spheres, and we'll tease out each of those. So with distribution, who is receiving benefits from the environment and resources, who's bearing the cost of environmental concerns, and who's facing environmental risks. Carbon emissions, one of the kind of on the global scale, big question in terms of global inequality rather than a particular American form of racism. Climate change, of course, kind of comes up almost immediately. And the people and countries that are contributing most to climate change are not those who are most at risk, right? So there's this massive inequality in terms of who's benefiting from lots of carbon use, high energy lifestyles, and those who are facing habitat and country loss in the case of many island nations from rising sea levels, increased natural disasters, and that kind of thing. So 986, that number in front of you, that is the approximate number of kilograms of carbon dioxide that a flight from London to New York, which almost all of us take at least once a year while we're on the Marshall tenure, that's your personal carbon emissions on that flight. That number is more than the average sub-Saharan Africa uses in an entire year in terms of carbon emissions, right? Just to kind of give you a sense of the disparity in terms of usage. So that's one question, is just who's using what and then who's getting slammed with the consequences of that. One that's come up in particular in times of COVID and lockdown is access to green spaces. 1% is how many of Yosemite National Park's visitors each year are Black, compared to 14% of the US population being that. In addition, Black, Indigenous, and persons of color, especially in urban spaces, are far less likely to have a garden. And certainly during the time of intense lockdown, that is really a major kind of indicator of have and have nots, along with mental well-being and physical health. Do you have access to some kind of green space? So there's the question of private gardens and balconies. There's also the question of parks and public green spaces. And in both the UK and the US, numerous community groups and planning officers have found that parks and green spaces more closely located to BIPOC communities were likely to be closed, completely shut. Oftentimes they're smaller, so social distancing is harder. Often they're less resourced, so it's harder to do it safely and that kind of thing. But that then further marginalizes and makes it even less likely that BIPOC individuals in both the US and the UK have access to green space while we're under a public health lockdown situation. And then the last bit on distribution that I'll highlight, just to kind of give a sense of how widespread this is, 66%. That is the number in terms of people of color in the US face every day and inhale 66% more soot, air pollution than their white peers. And it remains the case that race is the biggest indicator of whether or not a person in the US is living in close proximity to contaminated air, water, or soil. There's a huge suite of reasons that that is the case. Some of it is intentional policy planning. Some of it is very much tied and correlated with economic status and all these kind of things. We can tease that out in the discussion. But here we go, just some of the ways that this is carried out. Moving from distribution then to recognition, we're looking at who's acknowledged, who's taken into account, and who at the end of the day do we care about when we're thinking about environmental planning and policies. One question of recognition is just what are we even thinking about issue-wise, and are we willing to confront the inequality and kind of recognize the fact that all of these access and risk disparities that we just walked through are existent. I've put the EPA up there because in the past year, a very interesting thing has happened to Google. 2 years ago, if you Googled environmental racism, immediately comes up the definition of environmental racism created by the US Environmental Protection Agency, which is talking about the decreased access for BIPOC communities in the US to green spaces and their increased risk of being near contaminated areas. Today, the EPA website does not have anything about environmental racism anymore. They do have environmental justice where they talk a bit about persons of color, but that entire definition has just been pulled out. That is no longer part of the discussion under the current administration. So part of the recognition of environmental justice then is we have to confront the inequalities, we have to name them. And one of the questions that I definitely have for Nico, Bianca, and the rest of you is how would you propose, or where do you see energy needing to go at when so much of the fight for racial injustice is simply one of convincing a huge number of people and policymakers that there's a problem even in the first place, right? Another aspect of recognition then is who else is considered a stakeholder? Who do we care about? So are we even recognizing Black, Indigenous, and persons of color as full stakeholders in the human game? What about future generations? 1.75, that's the number of Earths that we currently use in a year. So another way to think of that in terms of natural resources, it takes our planet a year and 8 months to regenerate everything that we're using right now, a year and 9 months in that kind of space. So we're using more than we can sustainably, and future generations will have less of all kinds of things as a result of that. In the game of environmental policy planning, are we recognizing that? Are we considering them as full and equitable stakeholders? Do we care about their needs and desires? Where is that kind of fitting in? And as we'll get to shortly, who speaks for them? And then further complicating, what about non-human animals? Are we kind of operating under radical empathy and thinking of birds, bees, whales, flowers, whatever else, mosquitoes, as also stakeholders who have any level of rights in and of themselves? That 0.01%, that is our number in terms of humans, our percentage and proportion of life on Earth. Right? I mean, we are really a very dinky amount of Earth by both biomass and number of presentation. So there are all kinds of other living beings. Are we recognizing them in this game as we make environmental decisions? So we have distribution, we have recognition, and then participation. which is a really key aspect of any justice movement. It's not just about who gets what at the end of the day, it's also how did that decision come to be and what does that policy look like. For those of us who work in other justice areas, certainly Nico on criminal justice, it's this procedural versus distributive justice question, right? And in a true system of justice, both need to exist very much. So participation is asking who has a say, so who gets to talk, who gets to kind of say what they want. There to be who at the end of the day decides. I think all of us have been in a situation where we've been consulted on something and then, you know, whoever is the decision maker goes and does something completely the opposite. And on some level, there's a procedural justice there because your voice was heard, but did it actually have the chance to impact anything? And then of course, beyond the decision, beyond the kind of what's officially the policy or what's the law, who's implementing and enforcing. And we've seen that come to play in a huge way with all of the police violence of late, which we'll get to shortly. So just a couple of kind of notes of the way that participation plays out in this game. 14% of United States environmental professionals are persons of color. So as compared to they make up 36% of the population. So by and large, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are very underrepresented in environmental research, science, national park work, all of public think tanks, public policy planning, all of those kind of issues. And we know representation matters in governance and decision making. So that's one big key. In the UK, in comparison, it's about 3% persons of color compared to their 20% representation in the workforce. So they're actually, the UK is even worse in terms of representation here. And then the Aarhus Convention, which is our biggest international legal convention working on public participation in environmental governance. It's a kind of suite of rights about how communities should be consulted and able to shape their own access to natural resources and the way those are used. 47 is the number of signatories to that convention. And you all can probably guess between the US and the UK, which of the countries has not signed on or ratified that treaty. Yeah, America is generally quite bad at agreeing to being held up to international legal instruments, and that has a huge impact in the environmental space since so much of environmental planning and climate change issues require fully multilateral and global action, and the US is kind of consistently not fully on board in those areas, even as it's one of the biggest contributors to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. So that's one major issue. And then in particular, I would say, as we think about participation and the way these are implemented and carried out, budgets reflect our values. And 5.7 million is the what Trump proposed for the EPA budget. That's a 31% decrease from previous. 5.7 million also happens to be the New York Police Department budget, by the way. So just in terms of comparison, right? Like we are putting as a country as much money into policing New York as we are to our entire country's environmental protection and policy planning spaces. That's not the full number now. For the 2021 year, they are looking at around, let me see, 6.7 or thereabouts. It's going to be about 0.1% of the federal budget is the EPA, whereas the NYPD is about 5 to 6% of the cities. So proportionally, the New York police get 50 times more of the budget share compared to the city as the EPA does to the country's budget. So just in terms of where we put our money and what we're thinking about, that's definitely one thing to consider in justice. And then wrapping up and transitioning right over to Nico to talk more about incarceration and the impacts of what this looks like, and then Bianca to bring up on how much the environmental aspects are impacting health in the midst of COVID. 45, 550, and 300. It's 45% of inmates who are incarcerated under the 3-strike penalty are Black males. And it's consistently around 40% across the board in terms of jail time. Again, even though that's 14% of the population in the US are Black, so massively, massively overrepresented. And so you take a completely disproportionate number of minorities, you place them in incarceration, where they are 550% more likely to contract COVID and 300% more likely to die from it. for a variety of reasons. I will go ahead and pause there. I have just thrown a lot at you, I realize, but we're gonna shift over to Nico to talk a little bit more about what that looks like in incarceration and how he's seen some of these issues play out, both in general in the US criminal justice system, and then as things are shifting to COVID.
Thanks. All right, so jumping right in. So when we're thinking about what the epicenters are of COVID-19 in terms of the United States, most of the conversation is happening in terms of cities, right? Like New York at one point was the epicenter. Now we're thinking about states like Texas and Florida. But if we look at rates and include or separate from cities, jails and prisons and detention centers, we see the actual epicenter has been consistently these spaces, right? When we're thinking about jails and prisons. So just one example, here in New York City, Rikers Island, the rate of infection has, hovered around between 7 to 8% relative to the entire city, which has been hovering between 2 and 3%. And then obviously the data for the United States as a whole is rather shaky when we think about it, but around 1 to 2%, right? And so we see that the highest risk in terms of being infected with COVID-19 isn't necessarily anywhere outside or beyond prisons and jails. And this is not only true for those who are incarcerated, but we're also thinking about staff, right? So correctional officers, medical personnel that have to be in jails and prisons who are now addressing this problem of COVID-19 and people getting sick within prison. On the other hand, right, we have now sort of this moment where a lot of jurisdictions across the country have decided to decarcerate in an accelerated way. So for the first time in 70 years, the population at Rikers Island has dipped below 4,000. And that was seen as sort of a victory. We're starting to get more people out. A lot of us pushed within the field for decarceration efforts, just given that the risk of infection was so high. But then this presents another challenge, right? The infrastructure outside of jails and prisons for people who are justice involved. And so a lot of it was ad hoc, right? It was just letting people out without thinking about quarantining, without giving people, space to quarantine. Here in New York City, at some point, we were trying to get folk into hotels for 2 weeks at least who were coming out of Rikers Island. But again, just giving people masks, giving people access to testing, giving people access to any medical care, then questions about insurance, employment, financial assistance, even access to stimulus checks, right? Which right now we're seeing a lot of stories come out that folk who who are justice involved can't get access to these stimulus checks. And so the problem is compounded within prisons and jails, and that is true for virtually every single carceral setting, and not just jails, not just prisons, but we're seeing it in terms of detention centers. And if we're thinking about deportations too, right? In the past few months, this number might be wrong, but I want to say 40,000 folk have been deported from the US. And a lot of it hasn't just been from point A to point B, but a lot of these flights have gone from one city to another within the US. And then, people being deported back to their home countries or another country, the country of origin, right? And a lot of these folk have gone disproportionately to areas that are actually don't have the infrastructure that they need to address, people coming in with a higher risk of infection, one of those being Central America, right? And if we're thinking about the connection still within the context of a criminal justice system, President Bukele in El Salvador, to flex his muscles, I guess, I don't know if anyone saw, but just released a bunch of photographs of his prisons, right? And what he was doing to address MS-13, people in close quarters, the way they were positioned, and to sort of say, like, look what I'm doing to address the problem in the middle of a pandemic, right, where there was no social distancing in the prisons in El Salvador. And so again, right, we're seeing the effects of the virus being compounded in every single carceral setting. And we've done certain things to address it, right? Like courts have mostly gone virtual, only are meeting for emergencies, court dates are being pushed back. But then if we think about the structural and community sort of impact and how this ties back to environmental racism, right? A lot of the community's impacts are both in urban and rural settings. In urban settings, you know, high density, and thinking about policing, thinking about, you know, the how certain communities that are typically Black are more heavily policed than other communities. But then also a question of access to resources, right? The biggest spike in mass incarceration didn't happen in cities, it happened in rural areas, right? And how we imagine in rural areas there being space and a lot of farmland and whatnot. We also have to think about the access to resources or access to medical care, and even, you know, the structural realities of healthcare, right? And so again, in rural areas where the, you know, rate of the impact of policing is high, then again, it's still compounded by COVID-19. And then within, we think about, you know, just the space. The air quality in prisons is horrible. Medical, the amount of medical resources people who are incarcerated have is bad across the board. And so the way that we're thinking about solutions, right, is not only just, you know, this is a moment to decarcerate, right, simply because, you know, a lot of folk, especially those in jail, the average length of stay in a jail is, you know, depending on where you are, but like, let's say a week. So people are coming out, right? People are paying bail. People are trying to get out of these horrible institutions. But now it's also part of how the virus is spreading, right? And that is not at fault of the people who are incarcerated, right? Because this is a systemic problem. But we do not have the resources in place to make sure that we give those people the supports they need when they're coming out to quarantine to have economic stability. I mean, a lot of them can't even access the stimulus check, right? So even, and not like it was enough anyway, right? For people who needed it most, right? Like $1,200. But the point being is that, you know, what's lost oftentimes in the national planning in crisis management, right? Any type of crisis management. I mean, when Hurricane Sandy hit New York, right? And you know, it beat us up. Nobody was talking about what happened at Rikers Island, right? Nobody was talking about how to include people who are incarcerated in that planning. And just, you know, the reason this impact is important in terms of talking about systemic racism is because most of the folk who are disproportionately impacted by incarceration are Black folk, Indigenous folk, queer and trans people of color, especially Black trans women. And so what is the difficulty here is, aside from the chaotic nature of the discourse right now, right? Every day something new is happening. At this point, if Godzilla showed up tomorrow, none of us would be surprised, is how do we center, one, Black people, but then two, Black people who are incarcerated and are sort of at the mercy at this point of people who have the power to make decisions based off of, you know, what's happening right now with the pandemic. So I'll stop there and let Bianca jump in.
Thank you, Nico. Whew, wow, and thank you, Becca. I mean, just every time I hear about these issues, it fills me with anger, but then I stop and I think, okay, but what can we do about the situation? And there's so much that we can do, especially non-Black, non-Indigenous allies. There's so much that we can do to support these efforts. So maybe I'll start with the example of COVID-19 and health. And I think it's no secret to all of us that in the United States, we've seen huge health disparities related to COVID-19 morbidity and mortality. Black, Indigenous, and people of color, in particular, also Latinx communities have 4 to 5 times the rate of hospitalizations, COVID, and Black folks in particular have over twice the mortality due to COVID relative to the entire US population. And you might ask, why is this the case? And this goes back to fundamental issues that are rooted in our society. It goes back to the fact that there's distrust of the medical industrial complex rooted in centuries of structural racism. It goes back to lack of internet access in Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. It goes back to inability to socially distance due to living conditions or due to being an essential worker and not having the luxury of being able to work from home. It goes back to having higher rates of pre-existing conditions and comorbidities, things like diabetes and other chronic conditions that exacerbate the effects of COVID and that are more prevalent in communities where the environment predisposes to these chronic conditions. And for me, environment is a broad definition, right? It's where we live, it's where we work, it's where we play, it's everything about us. And these issues, you really, I think COVID is sort of like this crazy storm example of how these issues manifest. And another thing to think about is that as a result of the pandemic, many federally funded community health centers and low-cost clinics, which are the backbone of primary care in America, have had to close because they've had to lay off their employees, or they've struggled to stay open because of safety concerns. And in addition to that, many individuals have lost health insurance as a result of soaring unemployment and other factors. And who does that affect mostly? It affects people who are lower income, and who is more likely to be lower income. That's related to race. And so you can start to see, how all of these factors are intersectional and ultimately end up in health outcomes and these huge health disparities that we're seeing with the pandemic, that we see in everyday clinic. In terms of like, okay, so what can we do about this? Maybe, one example is, I think there are like maybe different domains that we can think about. So one is in terms of our research. I'm currently working on a project to understand how the location of COVID-19 test facilities in Santa Clara County, which is where I'm currently based, is related to the disparities that we're seeing in COVID-19 cases. Because you can imagine, going back to environmental racism, the locations that the county has chosen for testing facilities may be directly impacting who's being tested, which then impacts who is detected early on and who gets the care that they need. And I think more generally, when you are doing research, it's really important to be mindful of the questions that you're asking and the way in which you're designing your research, and perhaps conduct an equity assessment at the research design stage to think about how your research will contribute to improving equity in our society. And I think that's something that I actually didn't really know about or learn until I went to the UK and I studied at LSHTM. And that's sort of maybe one like concrete tip that I can offer. And if any of you do have the opportunity to study at LSE or LSHTM, there's a course called Health Policy, Process, and Power that I would recommend, that really provides people with tools for research and policy analysis to better understand how your actions in your research impacts health equity. Another sort of dimension where I think that we can do a lot of work is in our education. So at Stanford Medical School, most of our classes, our foundational basic science classes, didn't cover social determinants of health and didn't explain, for example, how racism still exists within our own profession. And so, layered on top of the disparities as a result of all of these structural issues is the fact that our own profession has racism, that we've biologized race, that, to give you a concrete example, there were times when people would measure like the skulls of different races, and because they were different would classify them as such. Racism exists in the way in which we as medical professionals diagnose and treat diseases, because diseases manifest differently, and the way that we learn about it in our curriculum is through examples from photos of light-skinned individuals. And so there are so many issues related to the way in which our own implicit biases are then perpetuating health disparities. And we need to do better as a medical community. And I think COVID has definitely been a reckoning for the medical community in terms of thinking about more seriously about how even from the beginning, from education in medical school, we can address these root issues. And so I would, just for another like concrete example of things that we can do, a group of students and I have come together and we're basically lobbying or advocating for the School of Medicine to include social determinants of health in all of our classes, not just have a 1-unit course that explains what they are, because it's really embedded in everything that we do. And I think it's helpful to have institutions and to find institutions that will support you in this work. But that's another idea that I can offer. And I apologize, I have to leave soon, which is why I'm sort of saying everything now. But in terms of ways in which we as marshals are uniquely equipped to support communities, I think we hold a lot of power as people who have the recognition of the scholarship. We also have an incredible network of alumni, and I would encourage all of us to try to leverage that as much as we can with our voices. And also, I think we have a kind of an interesting, unique US-UK perspective. And I know that for me, in having personal conversations with individuals, because I felt that a lot of starting to change people's minds is really just about sitting down with someone, like sitting down with my own family and trying to, my family grew up in rural Central Florida and is a very conservative family, but starting to talk with them about these issues from the lens, using the lens of the UK as an example, which is kind of abstracted, has really helped them to understand why racism is such an issue in America, which I don't think they previously understood. And so that's another idea for a way in which we can use the experience that we have to be better connect with people who don't believe what we believe, and things like that. So I think that there's not enough time to go into all of these issues. It's really complicated. It's sometimes really frustrating. I'm a manager for the Stanford Free Clinic, and we had to close during COVID, and that was incredibly frustrating but it's again like a perfect example of how sometimes we can't leave communities behind at a time when they're most vulnerable. And so we tried to do everything we could to continue to care for our patients over phone, over video. We started a telehealth clinic, but it just, to me, like encapsulates how important it is to think about and like think about the consequences. I don't think the Stanford Medical School administration necessarily thought about the fact that we were denying care to the communities that we serve in East Palo Alto and in East San Jose, which have been disproportionately hit by COVID. But yet, as much as you are able to advocate and educate others, you can make a difference. And we wouldn't have reopened for telehealth had the student managers not come back to the administration and said, hey, we need to do something about this. So I think I'll leave it at that. But overall, health is sort of you see all of these issues manifest in health. And I think that's something that I've been learning a lot about as a medical school student.
Great, thank you so much to Bianca and for Nico. So we have this kind of American perception right now of two very different kinds of lockdown, right? One, the ways in which Black, Indigenous, and communities of color have experienced lockdown very differently because they have lower access to healthcare clinics, as Bianca was talking about, and also are more likely to be have less access to green space. And in essential jobs, right? So there's that weight. And then you have literal lockdown in terms of the incarceration system and the way that's playing out. At the same time, you have police violence and the absolutely horrific murder of George Floyd and many others. Not a new phenomenon, slightly new in terms of it being recorded more often. But the other thing that's particularly new in this kind of perfect storm that Bianca was alluding to is the fact that you do have, for the first time under lockdown conditions, more people with time on their hands for community organizing. And so we've seen now in 2020 a very different kind of response, both across the US, a response and awareness about how deeply entrenched the systemic racism of environmental and health implications are, alongside the police and state violence. And so you have kind of this movement that's happening in a very different way that wouldn't have happened without COVID, even though the George Floyd murder was terrible. And Black Lives Matter, which has existed for years and years since Trayvon, now suddenly having this kind of resurgence and moment and a great deal more support. And then you also have, because pandemic is after all global, this international response. So we're going to shift over now to Shama, who is going to kind of broaden the scope for us a little bit in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and how COVID and the international reaction to George Floyd's murder is intersecting with all of these issues. So Shama, thank you.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Becca, and thanks, Bianca and Nico. Appreciate it. And sorry that I was a little late. I was just tied up a bit. So yeah, as Becca said, I just wanted to sort of touch on the international aspect of COVID and environmental racism in light of George Floyd's murder. And sort of the way I thought about framing this kind of synthesizes a lot of the points that have already been raised, but sort of within the idea of place. So I guess 4 broad points under that. So if you think about how COVID spread initially, one of the biggest vectors of its spread was international travel. And in particular, there were, especially among those, the spread in Europe, there was a lot of criticism among those who were on ski trips, various ski trips in Italy, tourism, internationally, both from China to Europe and vice versa. And so if you think about air travel within its own category as sort of exasperating sort of inequalities about who is contributing more to carbon emissions, a vast majority of which are frequent flyers and those who tend to board aircrafts quite often. It underscores the lack of fairness associated with how COVID has spread and the impact has spread, but also in parallel, the impact of environmental degradation that was the precursor and an accelerant of COVID that happened through air travel. So also, when you think about, so you move from air travel, you think about the affluent people who we typically associate with air travel, but obviously there's variation. Then you think about the conditions in which, as Nico's brought up, people are incarcerated, and those also living in very densely populated areas within urban communities and elsewhere that are necessitated by poverty. So oftentimes in slums or in housing projects, in prisons, people are densely populated because those are deemed to be the most cost-effective ways of storing people. And as I'm talking about that, I'm like thinking about some of the legacies of that sort of dehumanization. I'm thinking about people as sort of costs to be borne by the state or by a slaveholder, bringing their property across the Atlantic. But if you think about place in terms of its proximity, that initial sort of movement of people from air travel into their domestic, where they live, helped spread the virus. But then once that happened, it wound up accelerating and disproportionately affecting people who happen to be in these densely populated areas, not exclusively, but to a disproportionate extent, to where you start seeing the data reflect that among poor and primarily minority communities. So I think that is the context in which this George Floyd's murder took place, because there were already sort of preconditions within the state. If you look at both the inequalities of in travel and environmental degradation, but also in policing that overlap with this concept of space. Because when you think about a domestic context, so now moving from international to domestic, the idea of place also concerns the idea of safety and what it means to interact with the state. You know, if one's interaction with the state is primarily on the basis of being, you know, disproportionately policed, or encountering state violence, or being held under suspicion, then that really does create tension, and it makes it more likely for state violence to be visited upon this person, or, you know, this group of people. And so I think one of the challenges that I think has been unearthed by George Floyd's murder has been this awareness on the part of the world, but also domestically, about the nature of policing as it relates to place, and not just, you know, understanding place as a physical space, but also sort of a government space, but also the relationship between individuals and the state. So if you think about organizations like Reclaim the Block, there's been a lot of controversy associated with the movement to defund the police. Now, whether or not you agree with the slogan, I think the underlying principle of reducing how much police are responsible for doing within the standpoint of how you define their role within the state, I think makes a lot of sense, because it doesn't make sense for a police officer to be a psychologist or a social worker. Better to have someone, in the same way that when you call 911, when you have a fire or someone's having a heart attack, they either send the fire department or they'll send an EMT. You shouldn't be having a cop do that. In the same way, you shouldn't be having a cop respond to social issues. And I think that's the notion behind this concept of defund the police. And I think that's something that is becoming more recognized, but so oftentimes gets muddled within this idea, because people still are misunderstanding this idea of place and how it situates when people are dealing with the state. And then to touch on the last point about internationally again, I think it has been really striking to see how much people have reacted to George Floyd's murder across the board, from places like Korea to, you know, even refugees in Syria and protesters in Iran. And it really kind of made me think, what is the common thread in all of this? I mean, Becca made the point about people having more time on their hands, which I'm sure is important. But I wonder sometimes what made this the tipping point. I mean, you could say that there have been successive amounts of a number of people being murdered by the police, unarmed Black people getting shot by the police in particular, and that it wasn't enough to sort of release all of this international solidarity. But I think another dimension to this, I think, has to do with COVID. Apart from people being indoors, I think also it relates to people understanding and being able to appreciate what environmental racism and discrimination looks like in their own context. And COVID has almost been a flashpoint for people like Syrian refugees, for example, who are now bearing the brunt of, unsanitary conditions because of COVID-19. But that's also related to the relationship between them and the state, and in many cases not having a relationship with the state, and that not giving them certain fundamental rights. And so this sort of fundamental disjuncture between what is supposed to be a social contract as it relates to the state is causing people to reflect on around the world who they are and where they are in relation to not just their proximity with others, but also in relation to the obligations of the state. And I think people can see that manifested in, from the streets of Cairo to the streets of Detroit. And in their own way, they're seeing the failures of their government, the inadequacies of their government, not just in terms of, having a heavy-handed approach to policing, which many countries can relate to, but also in not actually abiding by one of the most fundamental principles of a government and responsibilities of a government, which is to protect its citizens. So I think that's sort of the scope I was looking at. It is kind of a theoretical kind of perspective, but the only other last thing I'll note is about this idea that Bianca mentioned about positionality. I couldn't agree more about the importance of, in research, thinking about what inherent perspectives or potential biases that you might bring to the table. And I think that applies to everyone. It helps to reflect, even in my research, looking at different perspectives and internationally, to think about positionality, and looking at countries in the rich world, but also in developing countries, So yeah, I think I'll stop there after that long spiel, and I'll hand it back over.
Thanks very much, Shama. Yeah, I think certainly COVID in combination with questions of criminal justice, environmental justice, and health justice is kind of really raising our collective vulnerability, our collective responsibility, right, and just how independent we are and these systems are, at the same time that it's highlighting just how not necessarily inadequate, but also blatantly, intentionally, inadequate, or they're designed to be bad for some groups of people, right? And that, I think, is one of the biggest issues in systemic racism, is that people will say things like the system is broken. It's like, well, no, the system works very well for what it was built and created to do. And so now the question is, how do groups of people, around the world, who Shama just kind of gave various shout outs to, and in the US and the UK, how do they reclaim that and imagine and envision and create a different system while we are still so stuck in the one that exists? All right, we just threw a lot at you, and obviously these are hugely complex, nuanced issues with very vast histories and kind of ways that they evolved and came to be, and where we are now in this particular moment. So I want to make sure that we give a bit of time for discussion. So we would love to hear any kind of comments or thoughts that you all have, as well as questions that you would have either across the panel or for particular members. Bianca did have to duck out, but has left her email in the chat. And Shama and I will, kind of try and jump in from what bits of health that we do have, but we also have in the audience a number of other healthcare professionals who can jump in for those kind of questions as well. So questions, feel free to ping them in the chat or unmute yourself and jump in here.
Hey guys, thank you so much for this talk. This was really wonderful and enlightening, and thank you for holding the space for us. The question I have is related to gender at an intersection of all of these issues, because that didn't really come up in these discussions. But we know that during this pandemic, women are bearing an extra burden, whether that has to do with how women's bodies are treated by the healthcare system, whether that has to do with the sorts of organizing we can do around when women experience police violence, and whether that organizing is taken seriously by systems that we are trying to hold accountable. So I would love to hear each of you speak to the role gender might play or could in the future play in your research and work.
Thanks, absolutely. And I think one of the biggest issues, as soon as we start to look at environmental and health kind of demographics and results, Black women are consistently, right, the most vulnerable, marginalized community that the United States and generally the world has. And a huge part of that is certainly because of all of these different systemic factors that we were pointing to in terms of access to resource, proximity to contaminated, and lack of proximity to healthcare and green space and all those kind of things. But a huge part of it is also in the way Black women are or are not, more often, considered to be, kind of full agents, and fully intelligent and full beings to professionals, right? I mean, so Black women are hugely less likely to be taken seriously by a doctor when they're describing their own symptoms, right? And so many misdiagnoses and really problematic forms of care are happening in that space because of the both implicit and explicit biases within the medical profession. And the same thing with environmental spaces, right? Where women are kind of so assumed to be tied, closer to nature with childcare and domestic labor and these kind of things, at the same time that they're hugely unlikely to access for recreational purposes and or are more likely to be carrying environmental costs of labor. So there's this bizarre double standard where women are both more tied to nature and devalued because of that, in the same way, that of course with climate change, we know that, as a species, we're very bad at valuing the planet. So of course, when we, associate women with the planet, we're going to devalue them as part of that discussion as well. So I think that's kind of where my brain immediately goes. And just kind of the way we construct and assume gender roles kind of plays into and further exacerbates these issues. And then Nico will, again, definitely speak more about the particular role of Black trans women in incarceration and the huge burden there. But I think it also raises a question as we're thinking of community organizing, the Black Lives Matter movement, and how many times historically the United States has done kind of great advancements, legally speaking, for equality, and consistently, you know, the kind of elite community organizers are managing to push out some part of the community, some part of their own population, in order to achieve that legal victory, right? This has come up with Hamilton in terms of the slavery question, right? But then if you think of suffrage, right, and white women who were organizing that movement, intentionally not allowing Black women to vote because, or to march with them, because that would hamper white women's ability to get the vote, right? And that's happening over and over, you know, and now, I mean, with the Equal Rights Amendment, and the Marshall Commission will have another event on that. Thanks to a book that's coming out, but there's a huge issue there in terms of the intersectionality between all of these different identity and demographic factors that are so influencing individual as well as community outcomes.
Yeah, I'll speak to a little bit about, you know, sort of that this has also compounded a lot of the things that folk who are not cis men have had to experience. So, you know, if we're thinking about the spike in reported cases of domestic violence, right? Or the reality of folk, you have to stay at home, and what that means if you live or are in proximity to someone who's an abuser. And right now, it isn't just a question of like women experiencing abuse, but disproportionately, right, women do. And so what is the solution here, right? Like, is incarceration still the solution? Or like, what do we do with those folk who are causing harm within the community, and what do we do with domestic violence? And I think this comes to the question of, you know, right now our current response to domestic violence or any type of gendered violence, including folk who are trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming, isn't prisons, right? And right now there's sort of this like moment of, well, everyone's on lockdown, services are reduced, right? Like clinics, you can't go to maybe a support center. And so it's sort of showing us the cracks in the system, and actually we have very little recourse to address a lot of the problems folk who are not cis men experience, and not to take away, right, the experience of cis men and how they engage with violence, right? Because the question of gender isn't simply a binary one that men are privileged and women are not. And so I think it's incumbent on us to like reimagine or re-strategize what we're calling for justice. And I think, you know, in the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, when we're thinking about the recent callings of justice for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, a Black woman, Tony McDade, a Black trans man, right? Justice isn't necessarily, right, any of these three people being like not killed, right? That is the ultimate form of justice for them to still be here. But, you know, would it have been justice if George Floyd's had only had an officer on him for 2 minutes and then arrested, right? Like, and so, you know, sort of fundamentally asking the question now of how we think about the different lived realities of women, of trans folk, of men, and how they're entangled in this system, right? And how now, like, we're just seeing all of the cracks, right? I mean, even when we're thinking about the difference between now, like pre and post or now COVID, right? Family court. Family court is not somewhere where we think about that justice is dealt for family and parental rights, and, you know, what children go where, and, you know, the outcome of children in that system. And now that system is sort of blocked, right, from functioning as it had functioned. And now a lot of people are calling, actually, we really need to not only rethink, reimagine, but in that process, we really just have to dismantle the system that exists now. And that relates back to both how we think about, you know, justice in terms of health, justice in terms of incarceration, even justice in terms of deportation, right? Like, sort of the solution here isn't, okay, we're going to deport 40,000 people, but make sure everyone's social distancing and having masks, right? That's not, you know, the approach to justice that a lot of us are now engaging with. It's another sort of fundamental rethinking of how society responds both to crises, but also the crises that are only compounded by the pandemic.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert as much as Nico. or Becca, but I guess in my research on civil wars and post-conflict reconstruction, before I started working, I delved into this question of the gap between law in the books and in practice. And I think that happens both in parallel ways, but also in overlapping ways with gender. So I think fundamentally, as Nico has said, the current crisis has revealed the cracks in the way the law applies in practice for people, you know, across different genders. And so, you know, even looking at the question of domestic violence, it's not as simple as it might appear in terms of, you know, how the state should react. You know, should the state react by increasing its level of violence in response to domestic violence? Or would that more likely to you know, be used to spiral cycles of violence? And in that sense, I think it connects to what we were talking about, at least in this specific instance, about how the variety of tools that the state should have available to it should be expanded. And that's I think one of the more effective ways to sort of create more, you know, a more conducive environment, even when it comes to gender, is by sort of diversifying and allowing the state to be more agile and more representative, so that it's not just in the sort of traditional paradigm of thinking about the state as the holder of a monopoly on violence, which is, you would say, very kind of paradigmatically very associated with sort of the, you know, cisgender, you know, masculine kind of view of a state as just being able to be essentially the way many police forces unfortunately see themselves, as the most dangerous gang in a city. But instead to broaden its own scope to see, no, it's a service provider, and it's a caretaker, you know, and the same way when it comes to policing, the state should be protecting and serving, but what that means is not just sort of using force when necessary, but in a very limited, constrained, and de-escalated manner, but also broadening the scope of services, you know, providing social care, dealing with mental health issues, in tandem with, you know, being minimizing people, you know, having to be exposed to domestic violence. I think we have to look at things holistically to be able to deal with these thorny issues, because they are overlapping and they are intersectional.
And just really quickly, right, if we're thinking about specifically the example of domestic violence as it affects women, right, a woman in a situation where live with an abuser that is also, right, perhaps part of what contributes to economic stability during a pandemic, when now suddenly no one has, or a lot of people have no economic stability. Throw children in the mix, right? Throw living either, if you're in a city, right, somewhere that's densely populated, or in a rural area where maybe access to help or even community, right, is more limited. And so, right, like the response here, the response that we have now is limited in thinking about the instance of violence and not in the structural reality of what that woman is living, right? It isn't thinking about childcare, it isn't thinking about food, it isn't thinking about mental health, it isn't thinking about where she lives. And so now, I mean, if this is a moment that everyone is like, oh, we have to rethink society, I mean, right? Like at this point, is we have to rethink our response to violence, and not simply in the instance it happens, but as it is part of the lived experience of a person. And that lived experience is actually quite common, right? Because it's not just a few people experiencing domestic violence.
Thanks both. Other questions?
Okay, Becca just patted me. I had a question about, so obviously I'm from a southeastern state, from Georgia, a state that experienced removal of its indigenous people, pretty violent. I was talking about like one of the ultimate acts, I guess, of environmental racism. And, you know, as someone who wants to be complicit then in environmental justice for those communities, but I'm a non-native person living on their traditional homelands and they've been relocated, what are ways in which, you know, I can thinking about being more creative in doing that?
Say the last part one more time.
Yeah, sure. So what are ways in which I can be more complicit in being a better ally for these communities as we begin to engage in work of like restorative environmental justice, particularly for like indigenous communities who have been relocated and as a person like living on their traditional homelands, right? I feel like there is an additional onus to be responsible and attentive to those communities and what they need right now.
Right. Just real quick, I think, a lot of us both recognize this, but sometimes it, zips past our perspective, is that there are people on the ground doing things every day, everywhere, right? We're not, I think none of us, and I'm saying this knowing who marshals are going to come up with a singular idea to like give land back to indigenous folk, right? In the United States or in Puerto Rico or Hawaii and all these places. But first is like really doing the homework of what's happening on the ground in your space. I know here in New York, there are indigenous groups that are struggling for national recognition from the federal government because the border of New York and New Jersey runs through their ancestral sort of land, right? And so for me, like my homework was just like, oh, there are community organizations doing this work already, right? The indigenous folk are doing that work. And so how can I help, even if it's something small, like telling on the New York end of the border of like elected officials saying like, you need to get it together and you need to support federal recognition and fight those battles. And so, and this includes like any type of work that relates to mass incarceration, right? There are thousands and thousands of folk on the ground doing things every single day. Even when it comes to Black Lives Matter, right? We're thinking about Minnesota, there's an infrastructure of community organizers and they just need support. Sometimes that means money. I know a lot of us have deeper pockets now, right? So like literally it is just monetary resources. Sometimes it's like you have a day, you are a lawyer, you want to pro bono it, like go for it, right? But first is like seeing what people are already doing on the ground and giving them what they need.
I think one of the things that I would jump in for in terms of just kind of the importance of education and the performance of allyship is land acknowledgements, right? Every time you talk and whether that's a kind of presenting on a university panel or host a meeting or what have you, you start with a land acknowledgement if you are on indigenous lands, which is like, pretty much everyone in the US. I thought about doing it here. I was like, I'm in London, like, I guess I could like apologize to Wales in a way. I don't know.
Yeah.
But land acknowledgements, it doesn't have to have anything to do, and it's better, I think, in a way, if it doesn't have anything to do with the topic at hand, right? It's just like, here we are reminding everyone of that, because for Black and persons of color in the US, the racism is incredibly acute. It is constant, it is systemic, in microaggressions and the whole gambit. And for Indigenous people, it tends to be one of the most silenced parts, right? I mean, they are regularly not included when we think about people of color. Most white Americans, that's not who we're thinking about, because we're so much more used to kind of vaguely recognizing the issue of historic slavery and that kind of thing. So just kind of focusing and saying it over and over as a reminder, like, this is a problem, we need to acknowledge this, we need to continue kind of representing and get the recognition part of environmental justice is a huge thing. And then the other thing I think that in particular Marshall scholars and researchers can do, many of us I know, I saw kind of all over Facebook and Twitter and whatnot, we're offering application support for BIPOC individuals, in terms of national and international fellowships and scholarships and that kind of thing. Indigenous communities are particularly underrepresented at university level in the United States. Not that university, is the be-all end-all for all of these problems, of course, but helping individuals get to university and postgraduate is huge in terms of representation. Bethany, who's on this call, was actually speaking at a Syracuse event on the history of women and queer communities in STEM, and we had an Indigenous student speaking, someone who's studying science, and the whole panel was asked to kind of identify a particular role model or mentor, kind of in their identity group, and Rhiannon couldn't. And that was the bit, like, that was kind of her biggest takeaway from the panel, right? Is that I have not, I don't have an Indigenous woman to look up to, and we don't have enough Black women in the science system. We don't talk about them enough, right? But they do exist, right? Whereas for Indigenous women, it's particularly the representation question is not there. And so, kind of purposefully, making sure that every time you're doing Black and people of color outreach, you are intentionally bringing and including Indigenous communities in that, I think is really important.
Yeah.
So Nico, I know that you have to hop off in a couple of minutes, but I did really want to just talk a little bit about kind of in context of COVID, a lot of the work that I've interested in abolition and organizing around criminal justice reform. I guess I'm struggling with how we've seen kind of this parallel happening of mass like marches on the street that are also particularly like white now in a way that they hadn't been before, and so we have in a way like this mainstream new component and new contingent that's participating in Black Lives Matter, and I think that I have like hold a lot of critiques about that contingent and how that contingent is engaging, but then we also have like the simultaneous conversation of how do we not forget and how do we continue to centralize people who are both already incarcerated or who have come home and really do have the skills and have the personal experiences of navigating a criminal justice, or I don't like saying criminal justice system because there's nothing just about it, but how do we make sure, especially in these like virtual times, that where I, as someone who was going into prisons to work with my friends and to do think tanks and all of those things, like those things are not possible in COVID. And I think that there's a way that like the state right now is actually, even in the mainstream rise of Black Lives Matter protests, disappearing the very people who are most impacted by this conversation. So I was just wondering if Nico, you in particular with your abolition work, but then also Shama, I think that in thinking about like how we organize within state spaces, but then outside of state spaces, how do we not forget the people and really make sure that we're continuing to centralize incarcerated folks who are basically being buried and separated and distanced from us more and more in these times of COVID?
Yeah, since I do have to hop off really quickly, and I think a lot of folk have already mentioned this in terms as it relates to research, right? So again, right now, most of the mainstream discourses around COVID, no one ever talks about folk who are incarcerated, right, at all, right? So first, it's pushing ourselves, both within the community, but in our spaces of work, is like, all right, if we have this question of, how this is impacting, XYZ communities, always including folk who are both incarcerated, who are coming home, who are still being policed, right? A lot of the folk who are being arrested. And then like finding just the ways in which we can amplify those voices, right? And of course, COVID right now has just made everything stand still. And we just have to get clever, right? So if it's journalists, right, it's figuring out, okay, how can I speak to folk in a safe way, right, who are incarcerated? So thinking about the ethical questions. If it's researchers, like centering folk who are incarcerated in your data and your data collection and the questions you're asking, just like we have to center race and gender and all these other factors that are always relevant. And then right now it's about being really, really creative, right? Even for the folk on the inside, what that really means, it's just like, a lot of letter writing, right? A lot of us can't go to prisons and jails, even folk who offer programming, right? And so thinking about the modes of communication that are available to us and then pushing for new modes of communication, right? Oftentimes a lot of the battles across any jurisdiction are about how folk can communicate safely from within carceral settings, right? How can they see their communities and families safely? And that gets really complicated, right? Because we don't want to, sort of fall into particular traps. One example is getting video conferencing calls in prisons. One, because of surveillance, but then two, we've seen in certain prisons and jails that they've done that, and then they've stopped people from physically coming in because like, oh, you can see your mom over the phone. So why does she have to come see you in person, right? And so it's always sort of like fighting those battles in strategic ways. And then just the other thing is that, right, a lot of us have been doing this work for a long time at this point, for decades now. And this moment is this moment, right? But the long game is still there, right? A lot of us are saying, we're like, yes, people are talking finally, right? Some indication of like defund the police, abolish prisons. Great, it's in the mainstream. Like The View is debating it. Amen, right? Like these things that we're doing. Point being, that's gonna fizzle out, right? People are gonna stop talking about it. The next topic is gonna come. And that doesn't mean that the work stops, right? So the only reason I'm saying that is, you know, sometimes you're like, oh, like I have certain critiques of the moment and those critiques are important. But the longevity of the movement, it's already long, right? People have been fighting for the abolition of these systems for a very long time, and it's going to remain for a very long time. You know, maybe not in our lifetime, but the point being is that we've been fighting this for a very long time, right? This global battle has been 500 years in the making. So it doesn't take away from a lot of the hopefulness and drive I get out of this moment that a lot of folk are paying attention. With that, I do have to hop off. So thank you for the questions, but my email's there if anyone wants to, you know, shoot me an email.
Cool. Thanks, Nico. I'll just jump in as well. But yeah, I mean, thanks also, Emma, for the really, really interesting question. I think it's quite insightful the way you frame things, because I think piggyback on what Nico was saying, I think there is an important distinction to be made between the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's murder and the policy responses that were prescribed, which is, you know, some concrete things would include arresting the other police officers, you know, more, I guess in the medium term would be defunding the police, diverting resources to other programs to diversify the offerings of, you know, what should be a, you know, holistic service. And also then the long game, which would include things like trying to mitigate the effects of social exclusion on the part of those who are leaving an incarcerated setting and trying to re-enter society. So, you know, dealing with the social effects of, you know, the stigma associated with having become now a convict, an ex-convict, and then also trying to navigate employment in that space. So, you know, having to deal with exclusion in the workforce. I mean, COVID has already sort of accelerated the disparities that exist between, you know, minorities and white people when it comes to hiring. And that is in a context of increasing like historic levels of unemployment. So when you compound that with people leaving prison who are having to enter into this overlapping kind of system of social exclusion, but also employment discrimination, it's important to keep these kind of disparities in mind, that even within sort of context of disparity, there are other underlying contexts of disparities that exist within policing and within, you know, incarceration and the state. So yeah, I think that's important. And even like overlapping things like, you know, having programs associated with trying to bridge people from prison into the workforce, you know, historically that hasn't always been successful, but it's really important. And then also combining that with things like, you know, I think there's a system called Applied that has been used by a number of different organizations to try to potentially mitigate the effect of bias in hiring. That's another concrete way of doing it, but none of these things are foolproof or silver bullets, but those are, like you mentioned, things to keep in mind in this context.
Great, thank you, Shama. And yeah, again, Emma, thanks for that great question. We need to start wrapping up. And so I think my kind of final comments, and then if anyone else has any final, please, by all means. I do want to leave a mildly hopeful note. These things are complex, they're horrible. They are really hard, as Shama and Nico have both been saying. Like, you know, there aren't any silver bullets, and this work is going to be continuing for a very long time, you know, kind of no matter how many wins we may have in the next month or 2 months or whatnot. At the same time, I think one aspect of COVID that is particularly hopeful is that the systems are shook up right now, right? I mean, people are questioning, you know, what's going on. And so there is a window of opportunity in terms of kind of what else can we throw out the window? What else can we bring in the window in this moment? So it's a chance to reimagine the realities of racism and our environmental health and criminal systems, which is fantastic as we move towards kind of true abolition and justice. I think to kind of tying to Kevin's question on allyship and Sarah's question on gender and the way that those all perform as well. We haven't mentioned the phrase white privilege yet, so I will now. White privilege is something that I think has gotten a really bad rap lately on social media, right? Just in terms of white America starting to wake up to some of its white privilege and how entrenched the systemic racism is. We have a very long way to go before all of white America is there. I don't know that battle will ever be won either. But one of the, I think, most problematic responses that is, I think, kind of perhaps most likely or most instinctive or what have you, you know, as those of us who are wanting to be more white allies are kind of finding, you know, every day there's more that you realize, right? And another layer of, you know, just how insidious this is, we unveil. And it's really easy to be caught then in either white sorrow, which tends to lead towards savior complex problems, or white guilt, which is paralyzing. Right. And Nico was talking about, like, this is a very long movement, but the energy is going to die. Right. We know that it's not going to be white people marching on the streets for much longer. It just won't be. Right. I mean, it never has been. And so the Black Lives Matter movement, the abolition movement, environmental justice movement, like, we don't need white guilt. We need white anger. Right? Like this reality shouldn't piss you off, right? Because it's not okay. And anger is something that is much more sustainable and much more actionable than the kind of paralyzing guilt or the, you know, kind of like momentary sorrow. So please do continue to dive into and have these conversations. Do please, like, tap into that anger and translate it into the amazing scholarship, research, and advocacy that all of you are capable of, because we've seen it and you're marshals for a reason. And please keep the conversations going. All four of us, you know, we'll drop our emails in the chat. And send them out in a kind of just, I'll send through the slides, not that they have anything other than the numbers. I'll try and throw some annotations on the slide with some of the sources as well, just in case anyone wants those. And we're all very, very happy to keep chatting through this. So thank you for joining us for an hour and a half on a Wednesday evening. And Shama, do you want to say any last words before I pass back to Mary?
That was great. I just want to thank you for organizing this, and for Mary for organizing this, and echo the points that you raised, that, you know, this Black Lives Matter movement has had a flashpoint with the murder of George Floyd, but it's important to try to keep the momentum going if we can on long-term goals.
Thank you, all of you. That's been a really interesting and powerful conversation. So thank you, everybody, for contributing to that. I know it's a very complicated subject, and I think you all spoke about it in a very elucidating way. So thank you very much for that. The next one is next week. Believe